Canada. Similar patterns of unionization in both countries. So when they made their different strategic decisions, they were Canadian and American governments were facing almost identical structures of interest. I see. Okay, I'm looking at it when the slide is complete, so I now have to remember that you are not. So my hypothesis 3, strategic decisions in windows of opportunity. As I've already said, major reform means changing the balance of power or the mix of instruments in healthcare, and it requires a conjunction of two factors. A group of political actors has to be able to mobilize sufficient authority. It has to be able to control the levers of power that it needs. And that depends on both the structures of government and on what's happening in the voting population. And those actors need to form the will to take on health care. They may have mobilized a lot of authority, but to place that political capital behind health care takes another formation of political will. It is a very risky area in which to move politically. In those windows of opportunity, there are essentially two dimensions to the strategic options that that political actors look at. How much change can I make, how big a change can I make, and how fast can I make it? Scale and pace. This is a rough diagram of the map that they face in these moments. The incremental, the bottom left quadrant there, is basically the default position. This is when you don't have an opportunity to make big change or you fail in making big change, and you're cycling through the established policy repertoire that you have. If you decide to make big change fast, you'd better have mobilized a lot of authority and a lot of political will. And this tends to happen in political institutions where, such as the so-called Westminster parliamentary systems, where a single party can gain the majority of seats in the legislature and the leader of that party can command the members of the party to vote in favor. It's not the only circumstance, but that's the classic circumstance in which you can get big bang change. Well, that's not the only option, though, in a window of opportunity. You can use this opportunity to establish agreement on a blueprint. You don't enact it all at once. You agree that you'll actually enact it over time. And this tends to happen where, in coalition-style governments, where a given party can count on, or more or less count on, being somewhere in the mix, even if it's not the largest party, over a period of years. If you have a window of opportunity to move quickly, you can also do a lot of little things all at once, in what I'm calling a mosaic. And that's when you have, yes, you have a particular set of political circumstances that allow you to move quickly, but you've got to do a lot of brokering in order to do it. And it's the trickiest of these quadrants. So in the founding events of the systems that I've been talking about, Canada and the US, those were big bangs, actually, and I don't have time to go into the political circumstances that allowed that to happen in any detail, but essentially in the US you had the huge landslide of the Johnson presidential victory, supermajorities in both houses of Congress, a classic opportunity for big bang change. In Canada, you had a rare moment of cooperation between the federal and provincial governments. And you also, and I'm not going to say a lot about the UK here, but the UK, the establishment of the NHS in the UK gives another example of a big bang change with the landslide Labour election after the war. As we move to later reforms, what do we find? We find in Canada and the US that they're basically stuck from the 60s through now in essentially the incremental quadrant, cycling through cycling through their policy repertoires. The U.S. did have one attempt at a big bang change under the Clinton reforms that failed for, again, reasons that I don't have time to get into. In the same rough period, however, the UK managed to really shake up its system by breaking apart the NHS hierarchy into purchasers and providers in the internal market reforms. And the Netherlands, over the 1987 to 2005 period, is a classic example of a blueprint reform. They first announced it in the Decker Commission of the late 1980s, and they finally got there in 2005, taking effect in 2006. Well, you can guess how I'm going to fill in the final mosaic quadrant. And I believe that there we have an example. This is the pattern of U.S. healthcare reform now. It's a moment of opportunity. If you cast your minds back to the election of Barack Obama and the sense of hope and change that was alive at that moment, and the fact that for a brief, fleeting moment, the Democrats could actually count on 60 votes in caucus with the Democrats, you had the opportunity to make big change, but it required incredibly complex negotiations, not only with the Republicans. That certainly complicated things, and these strategic decisions are so tough to make, but arguably going for a bipartisan outcome or bipartisan process, essentially giving away the filibuster-proof supermajority that the Democrats had for a period of time, giving the Republicans the functional equivalent of a filibuster, even when they didn't have the votes, was a fundamental strategic error. In any event, Obama would have had to, and the congressional Democratic leadership would have had to broker within their party anyway, as we saw in the result. So you have this mosaic, this whole lot of little things all at once approach in the U.S.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, I'm almost there. So where do we stand now? The result is, in each of these countries, distinctive hybrids and converging agendas. I would argue, and I would argue at greater length with more time, that we are not observing a convergence across systems. We're not seeing a circumstance in which everybody's moving to some version of the same model mix of public-private. What we're seeing is each system is moving away from its founding identity in a more hybrid, to adopt a more hybrid approach. The UK has moved from the classic NHS hierarchy to an internal market. The Netherlands has moved from classic social insurance to universal mandated regulated insurance. The U.S. has moved from a so-called residual system in which government simply took care of the most vulnerable to a dual system in which it is still fundamentally based on employer-based coverage, but there is a real complementary system for those who do not have access to employer-based coverage, in which government plays a very strong role. And finally, Canada remains incremental as a single-payer system for a hybrid of a single-payer system for physician and hospital services and a mixed market for everything else. Currently now, most of the hybridization is going on in the mixed market for everything else category through provincial experimentation. We do, one more key point, which is in all of these circumstances, there have been entrepreneurial allies in implementation of the reforms. And in fact, if I don't get to my final slide, I'll be happy to stop with this one. In the case of the UK reforms, it was the general practitioner fund holders who saw entrepreneurial opportunities. And I don't necessarily mean private market entrepreneurial opportunities. I mean the ability to make changes and be rewarded for making innovative changes. So the GP fund holders in the UK were the entrepreneurial allies. In the Netherlands, it was executives in the newly liberated sickness funds and private and provider organizations. Who knows? Who knows in the U.S. who the entrepreneurial allies will be? The good part of a mosaic is it gives a whole lot of opportunities, potential opportunities to innovators. There are pilot projects to be seized upon. There are a number of possibilities. In Canada, I don't see much prospect at this point. The Canadian system is driven by the logic of the single-payer system, which locks physicians and hospitals into a tight accommodation with the state and basically squeezes out opportunities for entrepreneurialism in that context. Perhaps there is more opportunity in the non-single-payer context. And finally, I would just go back to Tom Rice's last slide and to suggest that the various issues that he laid out for the U.S. are in fact very much issues that are laid out, thank you, for the rest of us as well. We are all looking for a balance of access, cost, and quality. We're all looking to figure out the right mode of payment and organization, moving away from fee-for-service and global budgets, looking for outcome-based incentives, risk adjustment mechanisms where the Netherlands are arguably furthest ahead, looking for a politically and economically feasible balance of revenue sources, both public and private, shifting the balance between general taxation and social insurance, for example. So the U.S. is looking for solutions in all of these areas, but so are all of the rest of us. I have one final slide, but I think I'm out of time, so I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
I appreciate it. So thank you to the three panelists. We're now going to open the floor to some discussion, questions, and some of the response from our three panelists. And we have a question. Did you raise your hand? Yeah, go for it. Sean.
I'm a bit puzzled. I just want to say because I'm Canadian. I'm a Canadian living and working in the United States right now for the last year. And I think up until about a year ago, I probably would have been nodding quite vigorously with almost everything that was being said. But I'm not so sure anymore concerning some of the points made about universality. I think that it would be useful to be more precise in defining exactly what you mean by that. Because after attending some seminars by the CEO of Barnes Jewish Hospital in St. Louis, the biggest private hospital there, I was kind of astounded to learn. He was proudly proclaiming that Barnes Jewish doesn't turn away anybody, doesn't ask about nationality, doesn't matter what income you make. I mean, they just treat you. I mean, it seems to me, and this is corroborated by when I speak to my friends, effectively, the entire U.S. population is covered in some sense, but that the big problem, of course, seems to be the lack of portability of insurance for people. If you're wealthy, if you have some wealth, if you lose your job, and if you get sick, you might lose your house or you might lose your wealth because you won't be able to be insured because of this pre-existing condition. So I understand.
Sure.
Not full universality along that dimension, but I'm afraid you might give people the wrong idea that if you're poor, you're not going to get service, you're not covered. I think that's a little misleading.
Sure, happy to comment on that. Yeah, it's the distinction between coverage and insurance coverage and receiving services. So we do have a safety net in the United States. So if you are sick, you can present yourself to an emergency room. They may allow you into a hospital. So there is access to services. People have to wait a long time for these services, and a lot of the studies that have been done, in fact, the Institute of Medicine published a 5-volume report that concluded that the health outcomes for the people who do not have the insurance lag behind others, as best that they can, controlling for other factors. So I think that everyone potentially has access, but it might not be as good services, and it might not be getting the services on as timely of a basis. And what giving insurance coverage would do would hopefully be dealing with those things. First of all, you'd be able to get the services sooner. You wouldn't lose your house, as you say, but also it may give you access to a better provider. The hospital you're talking about may be an excellent hospital, but right now, if you don't have insurance, you generally you're not able to see a doctor who will spend as much time with you as if you do have coverage, because they don't get as much compensation. So I think the point's a really good one, and I agree with it. I think it's fuzzy, but in general, on average, you will get better services more quickly if you have insurance. That's on average. It's not for every individual.
Does anybody want to add something from the panel, or are you comfortable with the answer?
Well, I think it's probably obvious from Tom's response. But again, I also thank you for raising the question, because it's an important point of clarification, and it did come up quite a lot in the U.S. healthcare debate, that there really nobody will be turned away from a U.S. hospital. The hospitals are compensated to some extent through, it's, what is it called, uncompensated care now, or disproportionate? Disproportionate, yeah. But the issue is the timeliness at which people seek service, and the likelihood that, given that they have to wait until, or they're more likely to wait until they are really sick to present at a hospital, that it's actually worse for health outcomes and it's worse for costs.
Can I add? Yeah. That's obviously an issue, but I'm not sure it's the only issue. I mean, it seems to me that if I were an American citizen, I think I'd be able to perceive a major difference between having a legal contractual entitlement to receive care on the grounds that I had paid an insurance premium and were covered, and not having that entitlement, and therefore being, as it were, served at the discretion of the provider. And that would be a major disutility for me, I think so. But I don't know whether, in fact, there's any objective indication that that is a concern to people, coupled with the concern that you may not be sure whether or not a great bill isn't going to be given to you at the end of whatever treatment you do get as an uninsured person. So it seems to me that what happens in the US system is a huge increase in the amount of uncertainty that attaches to, the extent to which you will, when you need, quote unquote, medical care. And the reforms certainly go some way to eliminating that. I suspect also another factor is that your example could probably be replicated many times. I'm sure if you go to a Kaiser Permanente hospital, you'll get a very similar sort of treatment. But one of the characteristics of the US, I think I'm right in saying, is that there's tremendous heterogeneity of quality between different institutions, and it'll probably make a big difference as to what their primary institutional motivation is. So if it's a for-profit chain, it may be quite different from some other way of organizing. So I think there are other differences as well that impact on consumer welfare that are they're not perhaps quite as tangible as being thrown out on the street. But
I just want to conclude. I just want to agree with everything. I think it's misleading. It frightens Europeans when you points that says almost no Americans, X% of the American population is covered.
Yeah.
Or not covered. I mean, I understand the need for both ones, but this is an important point.
Yeah.
It shouldn't just be thrown out like that.
Yeah.
Elaborate on.
I think you're right. I want to give you one anecdote, though. Even though we said that there's a safety net, I'm from Los Angeles. And Los Angeles recently, a couple times, have opened up a big basketball arena, 10,000 people, for free medical care and they filled their arena and people couldn't even get into it. There actually is still a desperate need to get care, and I think it has to do with what you talked about, losing the house. These are people, of course, who don't own houses, but there is a cost associated with receiving certain types of medical care, and there actually are a lot of people who found themselves in desperate situations. It may in part be ignorance of where they can get this safety net. It may also be because there's so many immigrants in Los Angeles.
And just one more point on it. Yeah, Tom's slide from the Commonwealth Fund survey, and I'm not sure, Tom, I don't think this particular question was on your slide. How many times have you not been able, did you not seek care because of cost? Did you have that on your slides? I don't think. In any event, the U.S. has a much higher proportion of those who responded, I did not seek care because of the cost.
Okay, cost was a barrier, yes.
Yeah.
Fulsome answer to the question. Okay, next question. Yes, go back. Scott.
In making this comparison to the macro countries in terms of the quality of service or healthcare, some of these outcome measures are based on health outcomes of the population, and some of those outcomes are going to depend on the quality of service, but they're also going to depend on the input that people put into their health. So how much they care, they take care of themselves, so that they can prevent diabetes, etc. Have people tried to take that into account in making these customer comparisons?
I think Tom's slide on years of preventable life lost is a good international, cross-national comparison that targets the health system rather more. But Tom, you probably have something to add.
I think that I don't have very much to add. I think that this is an area that's ripe for research. We really don't know how much of the problem with regard to access, with regard to quality, is due to access problems or due to people not putting the inputs in, as you say. We certainly suspect that it has to do with access problems because there are poorer people in the United States are less likely to as we said for the previous gentleman, they have to wait longer to get services, for example. They often do not have sick leave available from their employer to get the services. So I suspect that much of it is due to things that are in addition to the effort that people are putting into their health care. But in terms of putting my finger on a particular study that's been able to control for the inputs, I don't know that we've really satisfactorily answered that issue.
No, well, there are quite a lot of aggregative epidemiological studies that deal with those confounders that can be readily measured. And there's quite a lot of there's a whole literature of the demand for health and the demand for healthcare that economists have looked at, which is fine. I mean, it helps you to understand a lot of behaviour. I think there are some dangers interpretive dangers. It can quite easily lead to victim blaming. So the reason why some of these lost years of life exist is because people have dangerous lifestyles. So they smoke and they engage in unprotected sex or whatever it may be. A whole bunch of life, and so the consequences that flow from that in terms of ill health and loss of expected life, and indeed avoidable deaths, are somehow get blamed on the victim. It's their fault, and it's not necessarily society's job to fix that. But of course, it doesn't ask the question, well, why do they have preferences of this kind? Where do these preferences come from that make them behave in this way? And ignores the other social correlates of the incidence of disease. So, all the evidence, not quite all the evidence, but overwhelming the evidence points to a very strong social gradient that links social class and the incidence of illness and the prematurity of death. It's a steep gradient in some cases, it's shallow in others, but it's almost without exception in the slope is the same size. Sign.
So we have time for one more question, and as the chair, I'm going to use my prerogative to ask it. And that is, it kind of builds on the other two. And I'm staring at Tom's slide, which is the ranking of 6 nations, which I found really interesting. I have the advantage of having the slides. Because it has basically the number 1 ranking, and these are all, just to the last question, mostly system rankings, not health that would have lots of behavioral inputs, right? They're quality, access, efficiency, equity, those kinds of and expenditures. And the number 1 ranking bounces around a lot, but the number 6 of 6 ranking just stays within the U.S. and Canada, right? And when the U.S. doesn't have it, Canada does. There's an exception, and it's also true that, at least in these data, those are the 2 most expensive systems that might have bounced around a bit. So, I mean, you use this slide, this is a question for the panel, even though I'm directing it to you, Tom. You use this slide to jump into U.S. healthcare reform, right? And then you correctly, outline that most of the healthcare reform is on moving towards a more insured population, right? And then when you look at Canada, which is a fully insured population, it does. It's like you're aiming to go from 6th to 5th at best. If you looked at this set of reforms and thought, what could you get from this set of reforms based on what other countries have? Now, that's loose logic, but I wanted you to comment on the loose logic and say, if you look at the reforms and you look at these rankings, is there any hope of getting beyond 5th?
Yeah, I don't think one can interpret it that way. If you think about the U.S. healthcare reforms, they have moved us much closer to Germany, the Netherlands, than they have to Canada and the UK. I mean, we had no chance whatsoever of having a single-payer system, and what we're doing instead is relying on private insurance. So the way I look at it is that we're really moving more towards more people having access to the moral equivalent of sickness funds. So I would think of us moving more towards Germany. Actually, it's more towards the Netherlands because they're competing insurers. I think I would have liked to seen us move more towards Germany and France with the sickness funds where there was actually some monopsonistic or oligopsonistic control of prices. But by rejecting the public option, we didn't do that. And I think instead what we're doing is relying on competing insurers. So in that respect, actually, I think that we're moving probably more towards the Netherlands, but a little bit more towards Germany and France, and really not at all towards Canada.
You guys want to say anything else?
No, I think that is true. It'll be interesting, in fact, to see, however, what happens in those 3 countries, in France, Germany, and the Netherlands now, as they look at controlling their health costs, and particularly in the wake of the recent Dutch elections. So none of these countries are. I mean, they are all moving targets in a sense, and Canada, in a way, is the outlier here. In its, as I pointed out in my one of my final slides, it has really made less change in its system than any of these other systems have. And if the U.S. leapfrogs over us in that ranking table, we'll have we will no longer be able to pride ourselves on having a better healthcare system than the U.S.
Yes, I was just going to say, I think there's one of the convergences that hasn't been explicitly mentioned by any of us is I think there's an increasing convergence on between almost all the developed world on what the issues are that need to be resolved. I think there's there may be a convergence on the values, but it's quite clear that it seems to me that it's quite possible that both